Well, let's take a look at what Charles Darwin had to say about all this. Charles Darwin wrote, "Why is not every geologic formation in every stratum full of such intermediate links?"
Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links?
Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain.
Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious
and serious
and
objection
gravest
which can be argued
objection
against the theory.
which can be urged against my theory. That is from Charles Darwin himself.
Go on then, what's the next line? Neither Empty Without Jesus nor Mike Riddle wants to tell us what the next line is, because it kind of destroys their little lie that Darwin had doubts about his own theory. So I'll tell you. Darwin wrote in the very next line, "The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record." And we now know he was right. In fact, Darwin only wrote about the expected criticism of his theory in order to rebut it quite extensively. Look guys, it really doesn't matter anyway, because you're trying to cover up something that's 150 years out of date. Darwin could have denied natural selection from the rooftops. It makes no difference to what biologists and paleontologists know about evolution today. After all, Tycho Brahe, who championed the idea that the Earth revolved around the Sun, abandoned it when it didn't fit his observations. But 21st century cosmologists don't go back to an Earth-centered universe just because Brahe did. Creationists have this fixation with what Darwin said because their beliefs are dominated by infallible prophets whose pronouncements were written in a book that can't possibly be wrong. What they don't quite understand is that our scientific understanding of the world always advances based on new evidence and the latest research. It's not wedded to pronouncements that were made centuries ago. That doesn't mean Darwin's principle of natural selection has been overturned. Of course it hasn't. It's just that it was simplistic and incomplete. Darwin had no knowledge of DNA or RNA or the wealth of fossil evidence we now enjoy. So it's not surprising there were things he didn't know.
So how come we do not abandon the theory, or at the very least, take what has not been disproven and revamp his theory? How come we don't do that?
You mean like revamp the theory to explain, for example, why we find sudden changes in the fossil record and not gradual changes? Well, according to this creationist, someone already has.
Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, he makes up a new theory called punctuated equilibria.
Hang on, isn't this the same guy who was asking a minute ago how we don't revamp Darwin's theory?
So how come we do not abandon the theory, or at the very least, take what has not been disproven and revamp his theory? How come we don't do that?
So maybe this guy, who challenges us to change Darwin's ideas, should talk to this guy, who says that we already have. Actually, this guy's right, and this guy's wrong. Gould has come out with a hypothesis, but it's not called punctuated equilibria, it's called punctuated equilibrium. Darwin thought species change gradually over time, but we now know from the fossil record and from modern biology that when an environment changes, evolutionary changes happen very quickly in response. When the environment is stable, organisms remain stable. We've also learned that mutations are not the great drivers of evolutionary change, as Darwin had proposed. But that doesn't stop the great creationist train from trying to demolish what they think is an unshakable pillar of 19th century science.
No wonder that 100 scientists from a wide range of disciplines, with doctorates from places like Cambridge, Stanford, Cornell, Yale, Rutgers, Chicago, Princeton, Berkeley, Purdue, Michigan, and Temple, including professors from Yale Graduate School, MIT, Tulane, Rice,
what did they do,
and
Lee?
the University of California and elsewhere, recently signed what they call a scientific dissent from Darwinism.
Oh, you've got to be joking. Here's what the petition said. We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Well, this is rather like 100 physicists signing a petition that says, we are skeptical of claims for the ability of Newton's theory of universal gravitation to account for the complexity of the universe. Careful examination of the evidence for Newtonian theory should be encouraged. Welcome to the year 1905. The puzzle isn't why so many biologists sign up for this petition, but so few. After all, the evidence for Darwinian theory, by which I presume they mean natural selection, is being examined all the time, and the idea that mutations alone account for natural selection has long been discarded. They probably don't sign up because they suspect that Lee Strobel, the thinking man's idiot, would then parade this in front of gullible audiences as if it was somehow a descent from evolution. But like most creationists, Strobel thinks that the theory of evolution is something called Darwinianism or Darwinism, and yet evolution wasn't even Darwin's theory. So, Lee, don't you have anything a little more up-to-date to report on?
Remember that origin of life experiment that Stanley Miller conducted back in 1953 that I told you about, the experiment that helped lead me into atheism? Well, now that experiment has been completely discredited by scientists.
It's now been discredited? Wow.
It turns out that Miller's concept of what the early atmosphere of the primitive Earth was like has been supplanted by new discoveries that show that the atmosphere of the early Earth was much different than Stanley Miller had conjectured.
New discoveries? I didn't see this. And I can't find it in any of the latest scientific journals or magazines. The reason is that this hasn't just been discovered at all. Not in the 21st century, nor even in the 1990s or the 1980s. Strobel's referring to work done by geochemists like Philip Abelson and Heinrich Holland in the 1960s. And even Miller himself accepted that his assumptions about the primordial atmosphere had been wrong.
And when you run the same experiment with what science now understands the early atmosphere of the Earth was like, you do not get the same results that Stanley Miller got.
Of course the experiments that better replicated the primordial atmosphere did not get the same results. In fact, they got better results. Juan Oro's experiment, 8 years after Miller, not only got a bunch of amino acids, the building blocks of life, he also got adenine, one of the 4 nucleotide bases that make up DNA. Other experiments have yielded complex organic molecules like pyrimidines and triazines. And further experiments have shown how nucleotides can form chains under primordial conditions, and researchers have discovered amino acids on meteorites. All this has been done in the half-century since Miller's experiment, and you don't mention any of it. You simply pretend that this 50-year-old experiment has only just been overturned. Just as scientists aren't prophets, science itself isn't a religion. It fumbles in the dark, feeling for evidence to try to understand the world around us. Every success has been preceded by a string of failures, but if you deliberately choose to highlight a failure of 50 years ago, ignore all the successes that came after it, and because of it, and pretend that it's been believed until only recently, then you're deliberately lying to your audiences, and you really should know better. Sin City Preacher goes even further back in time.
Did you know that Sir Isaac Newton said, quote, "Just as a watch requires a watchmaker, the universe requires a universe maker," unquote.
You mean Isaac Newton, the 17th century guy? The man who believed in the philosopher's stone, alchemy, communicating with angels, and magic? He's the guy you think knows how the universe began? Again, let me explain about these great scientists of the past. They were great scientists, but they worked with the evidence they had in the age in which they lived. Believing every proclamation they made without evidence is blind gullibility. Finding flaws in their ideas is like beating up a 6-year-old kid and proclaiming you've won the WBC belt. They weren't prophets. Their ideas aren't written in stone, never to be overturned. Darwin got things wrong, and Newton was slightly unhinged. Albert Einstein was bad at mathematics, and so stubborn in his philosophical beliefs that he rejected quantum physics. It's not scientists who are right or wrong, it's their ideas that are right or wrong. And their ideas are tested against evidence. So stop picking fights with historical figures and get up to date. Or are you afraid of new ideas based on new discoveries? Does the fact that our understanding of the universe is always changing and our knowledge always advancing scare you? Surely not.
And it'd have my kids, their brains would be fried with all this new evidence and this change of thought coming at them day after day in school. That's why they'll never go to public school.